Hello and good morning to everybody. Very happy to be here and very excited to be able to open with the second session this morning, the Global Solution Summit. We are in the midst of one topic that has come up about 2 years ago and that has been discussed a lot, the geoeconomic, geopolitical crisis. And this has very direct implications on economic policies and trade and international governance, global governance, and that's something we wanted to discuss. We, as a Forum New Economy, have commissioned a study 1 year ago to Shahin Vallée and his colleagues to dig deeper into the question, what does that all mean for especially the German economic model and the German export model, which has been, let's say, a little naive in geopolitical terms up to now, just considering economic terms, and has been confronted now with very serious geopolitical issues and security issues. And then we wanted to know how can we affront this and what does that mean if every country now, not every country, but many countries aim at securing parts of their production, of bringing back to local production, to not depend overly on other countries. And we wanted to know what does that mean for Germany as one of the biggest exporters in the world. And then the next step now for us, and that's amazing to have you around the table, is the question, what does that mean for global governance? So if every country wants to protect and de-risk, how do we handle this on a global level without getting into a confrontation? I'm happy to have you around the table. I will introduce you briefly and then Shahin will start. I will start with Shahin, who's a colleague and head of geoeconomics program at the DGAP, the German Council for, the DGAP. Let me not introduce it immediately to not make a mistake, in Berlin, and has been working on these geoeconomic issues for a long time. Vera Tortensen is head of the Center for Global Trade and Investment at the Foundation Getulio Vargas, co-chair of the task force, and that's an important issue here, and that's why you are here at the Global Solution Summit also.
From Brazil.
From Brazil, yes. The task force for on trade and investment, T20 Brazil. Moritz Schularik, a well-known economist and now for some time already president of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. And we have online Tanja van Melis, head of policy unit at the South African trade union COSATU. So a very broad range of very excellent people. Shahin, I would like to quickly let you introduce and give the main points of what you have done in the study on the German economy and the German model in the European context.
Thank you. So this was a joint work by, started by the New Economy Forum, which we conducted with the Center for European Reform and DGAP, and with colleagues Sander Torder and Sebastian de Quant. And our starting point, I think the initial concerns around fragmentation of supply chains came really as a result of the COVID crisis first, where we observed live how the collapse in global supply chains could expose economies to their vulnerabilities. And I think that was the first moment of alarm, and I think these concerns expanded as a result of geopolitical fragmentation, the war in Ukraine and the impact on energy supplies, and I think now more broadly the tension that we see rising between the US and China and how it's impacting global trade. Our perspective was that looking at export dependency as well as import dependency was critical, that we have tended mostly when looking at the COVID crisis to look at our import dependency as a source of vulnerability. I think our argument was that export dependency was equally important and should be looked at, and in particular for a country like Germany, which has very concentrated export markets to China. And I think the novelty of our approach was also to consider that looking at the trade balance was not sufficient, and that financial flows may matter as much as trade flows. And by that we mean both inward financial flows, so the investments of foreign countries into our country and into Germany. And you'll remember all of the topics and discussions around 5G infrastructure or around investments in critical infrastructure like the port of Hamburg, for instance, which I think Moritz, coming from Kiel, might be able to weigh in. As well as outward investments. So, and this, I think, for a country like Germany that has colossal current account surplus and therefore a large outward investment is a big issue. Where do we invest? Are the investments that we make, in particular in countries like China, that tends to mandate joint ventures? How do we control that these are not the opportunity for massive IP theft and loss of control of innovation from European and German companies? So we tended to have a very broad analysis of the situation, going beyond the simple issue of supply chain disruptions, which I think was the focus in the first place. And our analysis and conclusion was that in order to be impactful in de-risking the European or the German economy from these risks, there needed to be a number of policies in place, and that many of these policies were actually not entirely available to Germany on its own, and that this required a European approach. And I think our conclusion is that in many aspects, these policies should be fully Europeanized, and they are not. And even from the countries, and I'm French, even from the countries like France who have argued for strategic autonomy or for economic sovereignty, there hasn't been yet a great push to really Europeanize these policies. And let me name just two, and we can discuss them. One is export controls. So we seem to be all convinced that export controls is critical, and we're actually imposing export controls in reality by way of sanctions on Russia, for instance. But this is likely something that will expand. But at the moment, export controls are in fact national decisions. They're not European decisions, and so that might be something that we need a common approach to. I'm thinking, for instance, of the critical case of the Dutch semiconductor lithography company ASML, which was pressured by the United States to stop exporting a number of its critical devices to China. That was a decision that essentially the Dutch government had to face on its own, with very little, if any, European coordination. So that's for export control. And the second I'm thinking of is investment screening, whether they be inward or outward investor screening. These are also purely national decisions, which leads to very Kafkaian arguments. So, Europe considered that it was perfectly fine for China to buy a massive stake into the port of Piraeus in Greece during the Euro crisis. In fact, not only did we find it appropriate, we actually encouraged it because Greece needed money. China also invested in a number of ports in Europe, whether it be in France or in the Netherlands. But when it came to buying a stake in the port of Hamburg, somehow it became an issue of strategic interest to prevent that. And so I'm not saying whether one decision or the other was right or wrong. I'm not certain myself, but I think what's clear is that if the port of Piraeus is not a strategic interest, I don't see why the port of Hamburg would be. And so I think we need to have a common European approach to this. And maybe a last word. I think these tensions are going to become more and more intense if we are to head towards a U.S. administration that is going to be more aggressive in its trade actions versus China. Former President and maybe future President Trump has talked about imposing 60% tariffs on all Chinese goods and potentially 10% on all other American imports. I don't see how this doesn't force Europe into a strategic choice, because I don't think the US will accept to import goods from Europe if it does impose tariffs of 60% on Chinese goods. Because if that were to happen, basically Europe would become a major tariff evading platform for Chinese goods to be shipped onwards to the US. So I think what will happen in the US insofar as trade policy will redefine also quite profoundly how we view the global trading system and how we view Europe's role in it.
Thank you, Shane. Moritz, is there something to maybe keep it in the first round on Germany and Europe, something that in your research and in the general framing of trade and investment, you can help to governments to better find out where to join forces and how to join forces?
Right. So I think yes, we can. And let me start by saying, as an economist, of course, we deplore these developments, these frictions that have come up now in the world economy. We've entered clearly a new phase of globalization, and where, if you remember, if you go back 20 years ago, Tom Friedman wrote this book about the flat world, where borders disappear and markets rule. Guess what? Borders are back, states are back, governments are back. We are in a different phase. We don't know all the parameters yet. And as economists, I think we maximize welfare. That's how we think about the world. But we also need to accept, I think, as economists, that governments have different objectives, different objective functions. They think about security, they think about safety, they think about influence. And I think we have to accept that. And as Shahin said, we have to operate within these constraints and think about ways to find the least costly ways to do this de-risking. To, if you will, unscramble the egg. I mean, we've globalized the world economy, and we're trying to unscramble this to some extent. And I think the role that we have, and we've actually also just put out, I mean, you have this great report, and we did something with CPR as well, the second Paris report on European economic security that's out there, where we try to think through the different scenarios. And I think the one very important insight from this is that it really depends on the time horizon, how quickly you do this. If you sort of take these new priorities into account and you say, like, okay, then maybe we have to pay an insurance premium. After all, we've just seen a terrible war of aggression in Europe that has clearly changed minds for many policymakers. Then we pay this insurance premium against dependence that is too high, that can be weaponized and instrumentalized. We need to find the ways to do this most effectively and at least in the most efficient way. And I think for now, a lot of people come to the small yard, high fence idea. So let's keep the channels open as much as possible, but make sure that we keep certain areas where the vulnerabilities are particularly high, and you want to study these vulnerabilities very closely. And Isabelle Méjean did this in a very nice report, saying, like, if you look at European vulnerabilities closely and you take into account what can be substituted, they aren't that large, and it's really concentrated in a few areas. But I think these are sort of the parameters that we navigate these days as economists.
Mm. Vera, to introduce Brazilian and maybe also T or G20 view, what is your take on this, how to de-risk in a friendly way?
This issue goes directly to the core of what we are discussing in T20, in G20 in Brazil. Shahin, I read your report, and I really like it. In the sense, I'm an old professor of trade regulation and investment, and think it's amazing to see how the problems that Germany is facing is similar to the problem what Brazil is facing. Just change agriculture for Brazil instead of industry, the dependence on China issue. Now, what you describe in your paper that is important to hear is that geopolitical conflicts is feeding a huge trade war. This is my message here. And a trade war is going to feed back the geo-economic conflict. And this is going to be a very dangerous cycle. Look what you describe in your paper. You mention all the core issues of trade. Tariffs. You are using tariffs now because of security reason, the famous Article 21 in the GATT, saying, come on, for a strategic reason, for crisis, you can raise tariffs, and you can impose restriction on your exports. And what's going on? There is a huge flood of steel products that's not exporting from China to the United States, going to Brazil and destroy the industry there. So the dependency all around the world. You mentioned subsidies. This surge, this is what I call a subsidies war, is destroying all the regulation that it is. Because with subsidy, you can do what we can save the industry in the United States, in Europe, cars and so on, but you're destroying the whole process of what we base the trade issue and investment. You talk about, look, trade and environment. I am a green person, but look, what we're doing with investment is what authors are saying is green squeezy. You are imposing your restriction, your model of environment to other countries like Brazil. Come on, you cannot measure emission of a cow in Europe, in the barn in Holland, and it's the same that you measure a cow in Brazil. You know the methane emission. It's the environment now is becoming really a huge trade barrier. That's investment screening. It's important to see, okay, what China is doing. I fully agree that the sovereignty of the country to decide what they want, a kind of investment. But look how this is changing the world. And you see what's going on with cars. You are destroying the international, the globalized trade. So my last point is this: what is to be positive? What are the suggestions? Please, what we have to do, G20, T20, and all this exercise, can you send a message that please save the WTO? I spend my life working for regulation on trade, forget about globalization, but keep the rules, the basic rules safe in the sense, because what you are doing, destroying it, is to feed the conflict and the war in the security issues and the war armaments and so on. That's the point. The costs for what Germany and Europe and the United States should do is, please, could you sit down with India and say, please, India, why are you blocking the negotiation for more than 18 years? Can you get something around this? You are, old persons in the room. You are old persons on the table. Why we cannot do this? What is the costs? Can you measure, your institute, my institute, can we measure the costs of blocking the regulations on trade? The basic ones, okay, keep out subsidies. You must be flexible. The second message is this: please, lawyers, out with the lawyers. Put diplomats on the table again. Because you cannot talk about hard law in our world now. You have to be flexible. You have to be practical, as everybody is saying here. Out with the lawyers, put economies making costs on it, and the diplomats putting a stop on the blockage of what's going on. WTO is not going to save the world, but can help trade flows under some kind of regulations. Keep out subsidies out. It was an error to bring it. Keep out patents and all this intellectual property out for a moment. And okay, you want to use local content? Go ahead. Mr. Trump, is the tariff man, is the local. You are using this already. So what the consequence, I finish. The consequence of a war on trade is a huge flow of immigrants. What you are seeing, do you think that you are going to deal with the immigration problem with walls or sending them to Rwanda? Sorry, you have to help developing countries to raise again, to discuss again. Are you laughing? That's it.
No, nobody laughed.
Come on, Dan.
Nobody laughing, but agree.
You are not doing your work. That's the problem. Europeans, you are not doing your work.
That's the message of Shahin Vallée, so self-reflecting. I think the main issue, and that's what Moritz has said, is that you have on the one side this very more or less obvious costs of not
10% of GDP, that's the cost of the trade war.
And on the other side, maybe, that's to discuss, legitimate interests like keeping whatever semiconductors production in the country and so on. That's to balance, and what Maud said, it's quite difficult to measure the political but legitimate, probably legitimate interest to do so. I would like to introduce Tanya from South Africa, another part of the world who has also a stake in that. And you're from one of the biggest main unions in South Africa, so another interest, maybe view, and another view from you. Please, Tanya.
Thanks very much for inviting me and to all the panel members. I think there are a few key lessons that we've learned from the disruptions that we've seen that give some room for optimism. And I want to point to the role of stakeholders and the role of cooperation and collaboration. In COVID, it was through international cooperation and collaboration that we managed to get the vaccine out so quickly. That can only bode well going into the future. It stands as a shining example. But it also points to one of the biggest vulnerabilities in the system at the moment. The fact that 10 countries are able to export the vaccines. Certainly countries in Africa and South Africa only got vaccines much later, and that slowed our recovery period economically as well. So I'll point to another area for hope is the latest ministerial and the agreement on agriculture. 20 years, no agreement on agriculture. We got it this ministerial. So I agree with the speaker saying we need to keep the WTO, we need to keep the multilateral institutions strong, but at the same time, we need to use these disruptions and changes to bring in new innovations and to remedy more strongly what developing countries have been bearing the burden for very many years. I think I'm going to leave it on that.
Thank you, Tanya. Perhaps, Shahin, getting back to with some of the reactions and also the question, if it's quite more or less obvious around the table that there's a lack of common action also in Europe, any idea of how to bring the idea to national governments, to people, that it makes sense to act on a multilateral level?
No, I think this is a critical question, and I would like to get back to the WTO point that was raised by both of you. To me, the problem with the WTO is not so much that it hasn't been able to agree to a new round of trade deals, but it's the fact that the dispute settlement mechanism inside the WTO is broken down. And that I find a much more serious concern, in fact, that the fact that we have stopped basically progressing on trade openness. To some extent, to me, that battle is lost. So I'm not expecting great progress on trade openness anymore. But I think saving what I think is really the kernel of the multilateral system, meaning its ability to find negotiated solutions to conflict, is critical. And that we've lost. And to be fair, I think we have to point the fingers to the US because, and we tend to think that, the whole trade conflict started with President Trump. The reality is that, the US stopped appointing judges to the WTO settlement mechanism under the Obama administration. And this was carried on by the Trump and then by the Biden administration. So there is, in fact, quite a deep political agreement in the US for a long time now to undermine the World Trade Organization. And I think that's one area of multilateralism that is profoundly and durably weakened, and where I frankly don't see a lot of opportunities for resolution. It doesn't seem that any of the two contenders to the presidency in the US have any agenda to do anything about that. I would extend that breaking down of the multilateral order to the international financial institutions, which we keep talking about reforming, which we keep talking about making more representative of the global South, even though I don't like this expression very much. And in reality, we don't. So the reality is that a quota reform at the IMF has remained elusive. We keep saying that this is the venue for democratic rulemaking, but we keep refusing to China and to India a greater say, or to Brazil for that matter, a greater say in these institutions. And I think that's durably undermining them and explaining why countries like China are building an alternative set of regional financial safety nets and institutions like the AIIB to basically address what the IFIs are not doing. And I would end maybe on a more polemical tone. I think the UN also is being profoundly weakened. And if anything, the conflict in Israel and Palestine today adds to the enfeeblement of the UN. So my biggest concern is that the institutions that we have at the moment to manage the multilateral system are all collapsing, and I don't see a lot of space for addressing that.
We're going to wait for a war, a global war, to start rebuilding the system. That's what you want, right?
That's not what I want, but
institution, no, reform the institution. That's it. That's the big point, right?
Yeah, but so reforming the institutions is what the Europeans keep saying they want to do, but we're a bit schizophrenic about this. So we want to reform the institutions, but we haven't put on the table a proposal to reform them. So for instance, to reform the IMF, the Europeans would need to basically surrender some of their voting power and maybe unify their voting power under a unified representation.
Can I jump exactly what you put your figure on the right point? That is, again, the dispute settlement is how to solve conflicts on trade. That's the crux of the point. Forget about it. It's done. It was a play that was played by the Europeans, saying let's transform the settlement in a multilateral tribunal. Sorry, they tried out. The United States said no. So keep it out and try go ahead to the arbitration. Just solve the issue and gets it. But again, do you know the problem? Lawyers, again, sorry to say this, because it's a treaty, it's a hard law. Negotiators are afraid. I'm not a diplomat, right? I am a professor all the time.
It doesn't look like it.
No, I cannot be a diplomat, right? The point is, the diplomats are afraid of negotiate anything. Because of what? Because you are afraid of saying something that can be used against your country again. So all the negotiators get out and put lawyers on it. That's the result. They want the hard dispute settlement, and this is not going to happen again. You have to be flexible, to go to to maintain the basic law. If not, what's the basic point again is the fight, the war of United States and China. Let's see what you can keep the rest of the world moving. That's it. Get out with the owners, the big hubs that are playing, and let the rest, because the rest of the world has no rules to play anymore. That's my point. This is a thing that must be done. Forget about the dispute settlement as the tribunal of the world. The world must be changed. The rules must be flexible. Forget about hard law. Sorry, lawyers. Go to the guidelines. Just give us a lot of new issues, environment. Look, I'm studying hard on standards. Standardization is the most efficient instrument against trade, because the instruments that you use to measure the barriers, what you call trade barriers, is the technical barriers, is the way to impede trade. The rules of Europe is really destroying the flux of trade from developing countries. And then you talk about how to fight inequality. With trade, without trade, you're not going to fight inequality. And you have immigration issue again. So it's a turn. Thank you for bringing this dispute settlement on this. That's the point. Forget about it.
Okay. Maybe before getting to the disputes, is there any way to define these standards? In a new global governance order that defines that countries are, let's say, allowed to have some some de-risking, and if there are standards or rules, this might also avoid the conflicts afterwards, because at the moment everyone is doing what he wants or she wants. Moritz.
Look, I mean, we always had national security exemptions, and of course countries are sovereign to do that. The question is, where do you draw the line? If you think about electric vehicles, there is a case to be made that these are little spy machines on 4 wheels with a lot of sensors and video cameras that transmit in real time all the data they gather to this company's central headquarters in China or wherever. So do you want millions of these on your street? You could make a case this is a national security issue. So I think in practice this is going to be very hard, and what the speakers here say is, I mean, it just illustrates that we're moving away from a rules-based system. And the less, I mean, you know, I also, I'm not a big fan of lawyers, but you know, rules are at least rules, and in a way where we move away from rules, it will be the law of the strongest that rules. So the big guys will set the terms. So Europe will be even stronger in that world because you know, we have the largest market in the world, and the US and China will probably dominate. So I'm not sure from a sort of perspective of smaller players in the world economy whether that is really the way I would want to go. I think generally the big question that we're facing is that, you know, globalization, trade openness came with a promise both of economic efficiency and political stability, pacification. The world was supposed to be both richer and more peaceful. And I think we wake up now after 20, 30 years of globalization, and the world is richer, clearly, but certainly not more peaceful. And conflicts are back, and stability, political stability, both internationally, but also internally. If you look at many countries, if you look at elections coming up, you mentioned you mentioned the US and potential return of Trump. So I think this is really the driver behind now the sort of the fragmentation and this reshoring and onshoring and getting things back home. The idea that, well, maybe if the world doesn't become more peaceful, with globalization, we need to look after ourselves a little bit more. And then we're talking about the costs of fragmentation. I think those are economic. You know, we throw sands in the wheel of the global economy. I think the good news eventually is that if you believe what, you know, sort of the latest generation of complex trade models that we have, these costs, if managed well and not done overnight, can be kept reasonably low. There will be welfare losses, but there must not be, likely don't have to be devastating. But then there are also political costs, because with like de-risking, we also lose influence. Like we lose that very idea of trade that sort of has political effects, because we're no longer dependent on each other, and then we no longer sort of have influence on each other. We no longer have leverage, and that might be, as you said, reinforce that turn towards a much more risky world. So it's certainly not the greatest environment for global cooperation going forward.
Yeah. But we're working on that.
You're working. That's why we're here.
That's why we're discussing this, and it's because there's no solution yet, and it's very open, very new. Tanya, can't see you, but hope you're still there. Please.
I am.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think when one looks at the political cost and welfare costs, in my understanding of the paper, it's not saying that there should be a total separation of trade, that every country is going to go into an isolationistic state. But the de-risking should be very strategic on specific products and very focused. I take the point that one needs time, but what one also needs in order to de-risk is one needs a capable and an agile state. And that capability isn't evenly spread across the world, and there aren't the same state resources across the world to assist with the adjustments. So for example, where you need active labour market policy or social policy, it's very difficult to compare countries in Africa to Germany and countries in Europe, which are better able to adjust. The question then for Germany and the EU is in your adjusting, are you able to then help build capacity in other countries, such as South Africa, where you diversifying your value chains, but also then building a more sustainable world order, economically and politically?
Okay. Shahin, you wanted to?
Yeah, I think maybe, we talked a lot about the world, and we want to return quickly to Europe, because one problem I see is that the Europeans are fairly divided on these issues. And even though we've been talking about them for a while now, even on some pretty elemental things, Europeans don't seem to see eye to eye, and even French and Germans, for that matter, seem quite far apart. I find it striking, for instance, that Chancellor Scholz had a visit to China 2-3 weeks ago, and President Xi is coming to Paris, I think, as we speak, and apparently he will be given by his two interlocutors fairly different messages. I think the message by Chancellor Scholz in China was one of, Europe is open for business and fairly open approach. I think the line by President Macron, if we go by the speech he gave at La Sorbonne a week before, is somewhat different. So I find it difficult to imagine a global solutions when the Europeans themselves are divided internally. And so I think the big task of this next commission that will be in place after the June European elections will be to try and forge a European consensus on some of these issues, and that European consensus in many areas is quite distant.
Maybe, yes. Yeah.
You are talking about the risking. It's so funny. Look at the numbers. I love numbers and I love modeling also. If you go to the interest of Germany with China, the dependency of the two, it's amazing that Germany is not, and even Europe, is not taking care of what's going on in South America. You Europeans are losing all the trade with South America because China is invading the region with investment and trade, and you are doing nothing. Look, I work with the Mercosur European Union agreement for more than 20 years. And then forget about it. Why? Because of the France. Mr. Macron went to Brazil and said, forget about this old agreement. But look, it is the core issue of Germany, to export industrial goods to South America. And this is exactly what China is doing. And why we cannot do this agreement? Because of agriculture. Look, it's ridiculous. Look to the agreement. There are quotas for every product in agriculture, so that Brazil is not going to invade Europe with agricultural issues. And look at the restriction environment. So it's no sense to lose this opportunity. And this is done, I think. Forget about it. But again, the risking is this to explore new trade issues. And Europe's not doing it. Look, I spend my life in Germany, a lot of times in Geneva and Brussels. I work with the time of Mr. Delors, with the internal market of '92. This is the thing, this is the meaning of Europe. And this is exactly what's going, it's dead. It's being killed by these geo-economic issues. The spirit to maintain Europe united, that's straight. And this has been forgotten.
But I think since you mentioned climate and environment, there are very fundamental issues for Europeans to grapple with. And one is basically, if we want a hard line against China on green industrial goods, and you mentioned electric vehicles, Moritz, but you could argue the same for wind turbines, for solar panels, for electrolyzers. I mean, in basically all of these areas, for Europeans, there is a fundamental choice. Are we prepared to introduce tariffs to rebuild a national industry in these goods? And that means that comes at the cost of a slower and more expensive climate transition. Or are we basically, considering that China is a critical element and Chinese, green industrial goods are a critical element of our own climate and energy transition? And I think that fundamental question, so where do we want to stand on that trade-off, is a question that Europeans haven't asked. We've set in our Net Zero Industrial Act very ambitious targets for domestic productions of these green industrial goods. The reality is that this is sort of the European version of local content rules, basically, even though we don't call them that. The reality is that these objectives, as far as I can see, and maybe Moritz, the number better, they seem wholly unattainable unless we either introduce massive tariffs or we subsidize very heavily the production of these green industrial goods. And so I think we will be faced in the coming years with a very fundamental choice. Do we basically slow down the green transition in Europe because we don't want this to be essentially a Chinese-made transition? Or do we, invest and subsidize and introduce tariffs, in which case, it will be a European transition, but one that is potentially slower, but more expensive, and certainly more expensive.
I think it comes down to the question how big the yard is that we want to protect, and I think that's something that we really need to think hard about. I mean, the game is not the same anymore, and we kind of all need a little software update, I think, in our heads to think about these questions from that perspective. With regard to solar, for example, I don't see the national security implications of being dependent. I mean, the most can happen is that the climate transition is slowed down, but that's not a national security threat per se. So I think, but as you say, like, we need to think about these new parameters in a very strategic way, and I agree that we don't have the intellectual infrastructure within Europe and other places yet.
Yeah, you have the last word. 16 seconds from Brazil to Europe.
That is geoeconomic, geopolitics. Please do not kill trade, because trade is the most important instrument in the economy to maintain the world in the same cohesion. What you want, autarkies? The world divided in blocks, forget about it. It's impossible to do it now. That's more or less what you say even in your article. Do not kill the system, because you are going to have to build another one. Can you imagine 3 systems, the Chinese, the Americans, the Europeans, and the Americans? No way, it's impossible. The world is in a tangle already. You have to sit down and put some order on it. Take out intellectual property, and information technology and so on, but keep the rest alive.
Thank you. Good message. And to finish, I think there's a lot of details in the study. I recommend to you, you can find it on our website, maybe in the dossier for the economy. And then all the discussion, which is slightly general also, but I think it reflects the very fundamental question behind, because we're coming from one system, which seemingly doesn't work at the moment, and we have to adapt it. And so that's about big issues and also paradigmatic issues to believe in a new sort of global governance that may be constructed at some time to integrate all these aspects into the former system. Thank you very much, Tanja, Vera, Moritz, Shahin, and
Thomas.
enjoy the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.